Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Surface Tension, the podcast from Shobana Jeyasingh Dance. I'm Sanjoy Roy, dance critic for The Guardian. Shobana's pioneering and adventurous company has worked with subjects from science fiction and robotics to Spanish flu, indentured labour, Renaissance painting, and dance in churches. This year the company turns 30, and to mark the occasion, we're producing a series of podcasts exploring these ideas with leading composers, dancers and choreographers, as well as designers, filmmakers, scientists and robotic engineers. But we start at the beginning with her very first choreographed piece, Configurations. Configurations began as a solo called Miniatures in 1988, for which Shobana commissioned music by Michael Nyman, best known for his film scores for directors such as Peter Greenaway and Jane Campion. But once Shobana heard the music, the piece turned into what is really two quartets. One is the String Quartet No. 2 by Michael Nyman, scored for the classical ensemble of violins, viola and cello.
It sounds like Michael Nyman, but that couldn't have happened unless I was transliterating into Michael Nyman the rhythms that came from somewhere totally different.
The other is a dance quartet by Shobana, which drew on her background in the Indian classical dance style Bharatanatyam.
Really, I was a choreographer and a dancer at that point who was interested in the interplay of rhythm and bodies, and I had inherited a particular system. I didn't think of it as even as a particularly Indian system.
To discuss the work for this podcast, I spoke separately to both Shobana and Michael Nyman to find out how they met and how they created Configurations. Shobana, the striking thing about Configurations was its mathematical sense of structure. It was absolutely precise. It was not layered with the stories that you might expect from classical Indian dance. It didn't have the decoration and the presentational style. So choreographically, it was very geometrical. It was very abstract. How did this piece come about?
Well, it had a kind of beginning which probably is not possible nowadays, because this was in the years before social media and mobile phones. So someone I know, a colleague of mine, bumped into Michael Nyman in the bar. I think it was Riverside Studios, where we were performing some Indian classical dance. And he overheard Michael Nyman saying to someone else that he really loved the rhythmic patterns of what he'd just seen. So that was kind of reported back to me and suggested that perhaps, I might just ring him and see if he might be interested in making some music for me. Those were the days when Michael was in the Yellow Pages or some sort of directory. So actually, I just cold called him one day and I described what I wanted to do. He was incredibly enthusiastic and he said, well, why don't you come over? At that point, he was living in Ladbroke Grove. So I went to his house and then we started talking about this project.
So tell me what that idea was. You say you proposed an idea at the beginning.
I think my idea was to see if the Carnatic rhythms, which make up a classical recital in Bharatanatyam, how they would translate into Western music, how they would translate into other instruments, and what sort of impact it would have on someone like Michael Nyman. Much of the intellectual interest in Indian classical music resides within rhythmic patterns. It's a kind of a number theory in action via drums. Whereas, in Western classical music, if you listen to it with kind of Indian ears, rhythm is actually not the most interesting thing because, you can count fours or sixes or threes all the way through without any problem. Whereas with Indian classical music, part of the intellectual exercise, if you like, is to see how the person who's drumming and who's composed the music, how they've actually used the fact that it's going to be set in eights or fours and how they can keep on tripping you up and then coming back to the beginning of that 8-beat cycle. Many years ago, when I brought an Indian classical musician, a drummer, to Britain to tour, the first thing he asked is, where can I get a calculator? Because that's really what he was interested in. He wanted a super calculator which could give him really interesting number combinations. So I just was curious as to whether one could translate this interest into Western contemporary music. There was an element of it when you listen to Glass and Steve Reich, and obviously Philip Glass had a lot of influence via Ravi Shankar into Indian classical rhythms. And I was always interested in Michael's music. I'd heard Draftsman's Contract, and I could see that, his engagement with rhythm I found quite intriguing.
The way that I think of it, tell me if this is oversimplifying. In general, the Western tradition of music focuses on harmony, and its rhythmic structures are done by division. So you tend to get divisions of 2 or divisions of 3, but they're quite even. Whereas the structure that you're talking about, I think, is more additive rather than divisive, so that you can have very irregular numbers. As long as you add up to your final amount, you can take quite a different, irregular pathway to get there. Is that?
No, I think certainly there is that element. But I think because in Indian classical music there is no interplay of melody and harmony, so that interest in a way is put into another arena where the person who's doing the melody is also very aware of how the rhythm is being divided up, how it's played with and how it's twisted and rolled. So that's really the interest, because as a person who's throwing out a melodic line, at the same time they have to set it. They still have to set it within this number system that they've agreed on is going to be in 16s or 4s or 12s. And I think that's one reason why in Indian music you don't often just sit with 4s and 3s. You have 7s, you have 12s, you have 15s, you have 5s. So actually you're kind of throwing the gauntlet in a way of saying, well, how is that rhythm? You still have to evoke the same emotion. You have to have emotional interplay. At the same time, you have a very acute arithmetical sense of how this is all going to add up.
So in the Bharatanatyam style, this rhythmic structure forms the basis of essentially the footwork. And you spoke about throwing the gauntlet down. It sounds to me like you took that gauntlet and threw it to Michael Nyman, who didn't have this background or way of thinking.
She gave me a rhythmic structure on kind of school, like foolscap, children's maths paper.
Was that your gauntlet to him?
It was, because I think the first thing was, how am I going to communicate these patterns? Some of which were very traditional ones that, everybody inherits, but other things that I actually wanted to try out myself. Because obviously in the Indian music and dance tradition, we have syllables which we use. So, I could basically sing out the rhythm to a musician and he would know what I'm talking about. Of course, in Michael's case, that wasn't possible. So I thought long and hard, maybe because it's my mother's a maths teacher, but I thought of a graph paper and a pencil. And I just began to notate, which was really quite fiddly and took a very, very long time. And lots of graph paper and lots of rubber, actually. So I literally notated every single beat and how it was going to behave. But I think he was curious enough, and I think he was interested enough to actually pick up the gauntlet and see what would happen.
It was a kind of dictatorship of Bharatanatyam. And since I'm the kind of composer that I am, the music doesn't kind of flow out of my system and it doesn't happen like that. Everything is structured, everything is work, everything is a kind of relationship between one note and another, one rhythm and another. So the fact that she gave me this preset rhythm was just incredible. So I transliterated experimental music, European tradition. John Cage used rhythmic structures, he used preset rhythmic structure. So kind of brought all these things together. But with Shobana, this is what I had to do, and I had no choice but to represent the rhythm of her dance through rhythms contained in this string quartet. It was great. It actually it sort of gave me more freedom to be inventive.
But Michael, on the one hand, you say you had a rigid system that you had to stick to. But the paradox is, you say it also gave you a freedom. Could you explain that a bit more?
I mean, there are riffs. Da, 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 da. I mean, it sounds like Michael Nyman. But that couldn't have happened unless I was transliterating into Michael Nyman the rhythms that came from somewhere totally different. It's a bit like writing a soundtrack, when the director says, you have to do this or whatever. It's great to sit down and write music according to, what I decide. But if there's a kind of external reason for doing something, then it just adds an element of surprise.
I think once he said it's a bit like composing with one hand tied behind his back. So I think he felt a bit restricted.
I had one hand tied behind my back, but it was replaced by two other hands.
Michael, that was 30 years ago. Is that very different from other choreographers or indeed other artists that you've worked for? And what difference does it make?
So I've written 5 or 6 string quartets. I think the second quartet, her quartet, is the best I've done, because the material that she gave me stretched me further than, when I sit down and say, okay, this is what I want to do, and I do it, and it's fine. But with Shobana, this is what I had to do, and I had no choice but to represent the rhythm of her dance through rhythms contained in the string quartet.
Were you in the dance studio, or you literally worked to the score?
The influence started on day one with the sheets of arithmetic paper. And I think the best soundtracks that I write are the ones where I don't have to see the film. So the soundtrack for the piano was mostly written before they even started shooting the film. More or less the whole of the Draftsman's contract was written on instruction from Peter Greenaway, but they were instructions about musical systems again. So I've kind of been working with musical systems all my life, partly through Cage and partly through English experimental music. So everything I did was under surveillance from Shobana. And it's not that I wanted to kind of loosen myself as much as possible from that surveillance, because I knew that all those rhythms had to be there, but just to push me into a sort of creative neighborhood that I never inhabited before, that I would never have visited before. But if you listen to it and you say, well, this is typically Michael Nyman.
Shobana, I think you also specified you wanted a string quartet.
Yes, we kind of had a conversation about ensembles of musicians. And of course, in Bharatanatyam, the group of musicians is set. It's traditional. You have a mridangam player, you have a tampura, and you have singer. You might have a violinist or clarinetist, but playing in Indian style. So we were thinking about historically made ensembles. So a string quartet seemed a perfect idea, because the conventions were already there. It was 4 instruments. So for both of us, it was, I think we both kind of challenged each other.
For a choreographic piece to say, I demand that you represent this collaboration with a string quartet is the best news I could ever have. So that was already a strange kind of cultural combination or cultural exchange, because the string quartet is very much part of my culture. I mean, I'd already written 1 string quartet for the Arditi Quartet, and, I was kind of raring to write another one, but had no reason to do it. So she gave me the reason to write the second string quartet, which is what it's called, String Quartet number 2. It struck me at the time that the string quartet is the oldest unchanging musical ensemble in the Western world. So it's a kind of big thing to write a string quartet, because there's a lot of competition out there, either numerically with Haydn and Mozart, or in terms of kind of quality with, the late Beethoven string quartets. We're brought up on all that kind of hero worship.
Did you then go into your separate worlds, and he worked on the composition while you worked, because you would have had a very detailed score, a rhythmic score that you could effectively both work on separately? Is that how it actually happened?
No, because I really couldn't work on anything till I'd heard his music. He was always a composer who composed on the piano. So then I would have to go to his house to listen to what he had thought of. And then there was a long summer break where he went on holiday to France. I think that's where he did most of his work. And I remember that he rang me up on my landline and he then proceeded to play the entire piece on piano. But of course, in the piano it's different because it's only one instrument and you don't really hear the interplay of different sounds. And so I thought, okay, well, I think I understand what this is about. When I heard the string quartet, that was when I started having huge panic attacks because it just sounded so incredibly different to what I'd imagined.
So it was actually difficult for you to hear the score that you had supplied?
Yes, I think that's probably an understatement. I think some movements, for example, the first movement, actually I found it very literal. So even though it was easy, I didn't enjoy that as much as the movements where actually he'd hidden that material so cleverly between the four instruments. Because, I think what I hadn't bargained for was in Indian dance situations, that rhythmic information would be coming from a drum. You were conducted really by the drum in a very direct and easy to recognize way. But with the string quartet, you didn't have that conducting role, had completely gone. So then it was like you were running around in the sound world trying to find the information, and it was shared. And in some of the movements, like I think my favorite was the second movement, which is where the fours and the fives meet every 20. It was really quite difficult to find the information that the dancers needed. Whereas the sixes, he used, I think maybe in a much more Western style, because, there's something quite elegant about a 3 and a 6. I think the 6 could either be almost like a folk dance or like a waltz. There's a kind of plangency to a 6 because it just takes much longer to get back to the 1. So the 6 became incredibly emotional movement, which I was just completely surprised by at the point because I hadn't really thought about 6 as being a particularly emotional number. So there were lots of really wonderful surprises.
When it came together finally with choreography and music, I know initially it was a solo and it developed into a trio and a quartet. But can you tell us what it was like when you first got the music and performance together?
The solo was very short-lived. I mean, I choreographed it on myself, the solo. I really couldn't do what I wanted to do as a choreographer on myself. And there was a kind of mismatch, one body and this very multidimensional music. So I think that was a lesson that I learned because it was so incredibly multidimensional that really it became very apparent to me that I needed more than one body. And preferably I would be outside whatever bodies were dancing because I really needed to see what was happening. So it was then made for 3 dancers, but still very much within the classical idiom because they were Indian classical dancers, though I put them in costumes which were not Indian classical costumes. So I think they had more like a dress and leggings underneath, something that cut away the ornateness of the classical Bharatanatyam costumes, so, without the jewelry and color. So I think the visuals became much more muted in some ways because I think it's just because the music was so rich. So I had to kind of do a balancing act, And then, of course, the musicians weren't on the side like normally. The Indian musicians were sitting on the floor. They don't really take up a lot of the stage picture, if you like, just because of the difference of level. So actually, in a way, when they're sat on the floor, the solo dancer becomes something really iconic just because of the change of level and the projection, because most of the time they're in the center stage. So the minute you took away those things, something really had to happen. I think design-wise, I realized that. So we put the musicians on a platform behind the dancers. So they were actually basically higher than the dancers, but they were behind a gauze. So their presence was, again, a little bit more mediated. So I think it was a kind of, for me, a sort of balancing act once I really began to understand the music and got into it, and then I had to think seriously about what sort of dance would partner it intelligently. And then I think the classical Indian dancers, actually, they also found what they wanted from the music at times really quite challenging, because they were wanting to be conducted, and the music in many ways wasn't there to conduct them.
It sounds like you had an idea, but you really had no idea what would come of it. And it pushed both you and Michael Nyman into directions that you really had not foreseen.
I definitely got the feeling that it was a big challenge for him. But of course, once he'd made the music, that was his job done. And I think for him, it's been a successful item in his repertoire, because I know it's still played and it's been recorded a couple of times with different quartets.
What was the response when you first performed Configurations?
It was a really interesting response, which I hadn't actually even thought about. I mean, I remember the first time we showed it at the Place Theatre, 2 or 3 people actually walked out very noisily down the wooden steps in the middle of the piece, or just before the piece ended. And then I remember Joan Ashford, who was the artistic director at that point, saying that someone actually rang him the next day and loudly complained that this was an Indian classical dance. And I also remember getting a letter from someone who was an English stamp collector, I think, if memory serves me right, who'd been following Indian classical dance a lot, because actually at that point there were many fans of Indian classical dance. And he wrote to me to say how disappointed he was that I'd given up on Bharatanatyam and started doing this, what to him just seemed a totally ridiculous thing. How could I abandon such a wonderful tradition and do something that obviously wasn't as nice as the original. But, it didn't upset me. Actually, I was just too busy thinking about how I was going to re-choreograph it probably, or what I could do better. So there was a sort of a hiatus, and sometimes I kind of felt some people thought I'd betrayed something. I never really knew what I had betrayed, but that was certainly one of the responses. And I remember the very first press comment we had, not that it wasn't supportive, but it was very much actually concentrating on just the optics of it. And the optics suggested Indian dancer, Western choreographer, what are they doing together? So I think that was really what caught people's imagination rather than actually what happened on stage.
A bad composer would simply have written a kind of piece of fake Indian music and just represented those rhythms. But because I was a good composer, by that time, I just took it as a starting point, and it gave me a huge amount of freedom. So it's not remotely exotic. In the first place, you have the mask of the string quartet. The string quartet is not an Indian medium, and there are no folk melodies, and there's, so everything is kind of hidden, but everything is there.
I think we both had that word exotic, and only to put it away. I think it was at that time when actually that was a very potent trap that was yawning in front of artists like myself for many reasons. I mean, it was there for political reasons, social policy behind funding of the arts, often probably unintentionally, sometimes felt very prescriptive on what British Indian choreographers or any kind of artists, what sort of works they could produce. And often I think people felt that they were being asked to, in some ways, exaggerate their ethnicity in order that people would recognize that they're funding the right person, which is a bit strange, but I think that's the way it was. And really, I've always felt I'm a professional choreographer, not a professional Indian. Being Indian in private is enough for me, really, And to give Michael credit, he just wasn't tempted. I think sometimes people are a bit tempted to put, the exotic is very comforting for many people. So he never really went into that comfort zone. And I think that's really where we were truly aligned. We were both ready to do difficult things. I think that's Michael's triumph.
The Shobana piece is unique for me, and I can't revisit it because the only point in writing a piece with that kind of rhythmic basis is not that I sit down and I write my own kind of rhythmic structure, because if I write my own rhythmic structure, then I can reproduce it. I can just as easily deviate from it. But with Shobana, I was not allowed to deviate. And I sometimes have to remind myself what's there, because I have those pages. I mean, I have those 4 or 6 pages of notations that are very, very present. So this is 30 years ago, and I can still, even without looking at those pages, I can still see them. It was kind of like she insisted I did my homework, so there's that sense of discipline, but if it leads to a kind of exam result that actually is a string quartet that I think is very high quality and that never would have been written, then I think that's amazing. And if that quartet, which would never have been written and would never have that particular configuration, also works for her as her soundtrack, then it doesn't get any better than that.
This is Surface Tension, the podcast from Shobana Jeyasingh Dance, with me, Sanjoy Roy. Shobana, Configurations was also a big turning point for you because it marked your transition from being a dancer to being a choreographer, and it founded this company that we're remembering 30 years later. It also put you on a course in the arts world at that time. Can you tell me a bit about what happened then? And also, you were very quickly labelled as being an Indian dancer doing a cross-cultural collaboration with Western music, and that was the point. And I think it became quite a burden for you, especially during those early years.
It's still a burden, really, strangely enough, because these things go very deep. They're kind of part of the British DNA, which takes a long time. I think people can obviously try to change it, and I think it will happen, but I think it takes much longer than, one person's artistic life. But, there are some moments where actually it was more of a hindrance than probably it is now. Really, I was a choreographer and a dancer at that point who was interested in the interplay of rhythm and bodies, and, I had inherited a particular system. I didn't think of it as even as like a particularly Indian system. I wanted to see what was possible within that system, how I could play with it, how I could twist it, what differences I could wring out of that. So that really was my only, and has ever been my only motivation. Of course, it's very frustrating when people write your narratives for you. So you can't put your head above the parapet without being an Anglo-Indian choreographer or a East-West collaborator or whatever. So that's always been very frustrating. But I think for the audience, I just hope that what they saw, that was enough without them knowing the ethnic backstory, if you like. I mean, I remember we showed this piece in Blackpool many, many years ago. And one of the ushers came and said how much they loved those sixes. He really thought those sixes were really beautiful. I mean, that is what, I'd like to carry with me. And the labels I find just a bit distracting.
When you redid Configurations in 2012, you had changed yourself. You changed the piece. Do you think the context had changed at all as well?
I would really hope so. I think it has, because actually I was reading a review of my final, hopefully, final version of Configurations, and I don't think East and West came into that writing, which was very comforting, really, because I think when it first came out, it was very much, as you said, it was Indian dancer, Indian person talks to shock horror, Western composer, even though we both lived quite near each other, I lived in Islington, he lived in Ladbroke Grove, it's not that far away, I didn't feel I was crossing galaxies to get to Michael Nyman's house. It was just a short tube ride away for me. So, it wasn't such a big deal. So hopefully now people realize it's not such a big deal. It's only a tube stop,
Can you tell me a bit about the changes that you made in retrospect when you reconfigured Configurations in 2012? There were a number of changes that you wanted to make because you didn't want to simply represent it.
Well, I think the important thing to note is that it was still for very good Bharatanatyam dancers. So I didn't make it again for contemporary dancers, where obviously I've done lots of work for contemporary dancers and some even for ballet dancers. But Configurations can only really be delivered by 4 super Bharatanatyam dancers. And I think some of what had changed was that actually the super Bharatanatyam dancers that I found in 2012, they themselves were actually rather unusual people. All the 4 were from Malaysia. Two were young Muslim men from a government dance academy, actually. The other was a part Indian, part Chinese dancer, Rati, again from Kuala Lumpur, and Suraj, who was a South Indian dancer, but via Malaysia, Australia, and Belgium. And they were brilliant. They brought a kind of super technique. They also had an objectivity. They didn't really think of Bharatanatyam as a way of expressing their ethnicity, which I think really helped. So I think their combined worldliness, if I can put it that way, really I found very inspiring when I re-looked at it, and I found that I could actually give shape to a lot of the ideas that I couldn't at the beginning. And the world had changed. I think on the whole, perhaps, Indian dancers didn't feel they had to be very protective of a particular technique. And I think that's really what perhaps linked them to me. So I was able to work with them in a very different way, and also to communicate ideas which are much more choreography-led, to do with use of space. And I think this time when I looked at configurations, every single movement suggested a story to me rather than a collection of rhythms. And time had to elapse, and I had to grow as a choreographer. And it was something that I came back much later and had another look at it. And I thought, gosh, there's still something I want to say in this piece using this music. So I think that was a change that I brought to the piece.
Could you tell us about the development of how you started as a classical dancer and became a contemporary choreographer? Big question.
I think one of the things that I have slowly realized myself is, I was sent to Bharatanatyam classes. I mean, I had no say, because that's something that all middle-class Indian girls were often sent to, like, having piano lessons or just for one's general good. But I became very intrigued by Bharatanatyam. But obviously, when you do a classical technique, you can't help it. You become a classical dancer, not out of choice, because that's what the technique is asking you to do. So you find yourself schooling your body, schooling the etiquette of your movement, the etiquette of even your thinking, and especially Bharatanatyam. I think it's just a brilliant technique. Like ballet, it brings much more than just dance. It brings a whole education to the person who's doing it. But I guess I gradually kind of realized that, in fact, I really didn't want to tell stories only through that technique, that the stories I wanted to say were really in some ways stories about my life here, in Britain, and the kind of disjuncture that everybody has in London. I think London's a place of strange juxtapositions, in every way. So that's the story I found fascinating for myself. And I think I'm someone who's always been curious. So I was just curious about what I inherited, this whole world of rules and set etiquette. How am I going to use that to be the storyteller that I wanted to be, the stories that interested me?
It sounds like relocating to London was also a dislocating experience. Did the geographical shift force a creative one?
In India, Bharatanatyam is center stage. It's the ballet of India. It's where you don't even have to ask for respect. It's given. And it was a very strange experience to do it like I did on one of my tours in the town hall in Accrington on a very rainy day. And then you had to explain everything. So I kind of thought this is a very strange thing. And it's like suddenly this dance was shifted from being center stage to some totally different place. And it was a bit like watching something from the wings. So there was a kind of disconnect. And that's the story I really wanted to say as a choreographer. It was the disconnect I found more interesting than having to explain what the heroine in the Bharatanatyam dance was saying to their parrot or whatever it was.
Well, you're certainly no parrot, Shobana. And I'm looking forward to exploring more about your work in future episodes of Surface Tension.
Bye, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Surface Tension, the podcast from Shobana Jeyasingh Dance. For more episodes, subscribe to Surface Tension on iTunes, visit our website at shobanajayasingh.co.uk, or follow us on Twitter at sjayasinghdance for updates.